Good morning and welcome to Systemic Strategy Development. For those of you who haven't been to one of these sessions before, my name is Gene Ballinger and I host the Systems Thinking World discussion group on LinkedIn, and I spend the rest of my time trying to continue the development of systemswiki.org website dedicated to a continuing investigation into the realm of systems. And my apologies before I get started in that I have continued to relabel this particular webinar, and sooner or later, hopefully someday, I'll figure out what it really ought to be called. Though at the moment, it's now labeled Systemic Strategy Development. For a couple of housekeeping things, the webinar page, or the Systems Wiki page on which you registered for this session, if you go to that page and click on the Discussions tab, you can access the specific outline with which I am doing this session. And I wanted to point out to you that this is a live outline, and where you can expand and contract the nodes of the outline, and if this display is too small, you can double click here and go to a full page view of this outline. Each one of, well, almost all of the slides that I used during the presentation are in fact Insight Maker drawings, and all of these links, if you double click on these links, it will take you directly to that model or drawing inside of Insight Maker. The nodes prior to that are in fact all links to wiki pages, and each one of them has a video that describes that particular segment of this webinar. So the videos are all, I don't know, 8 to 12 minutes long. It's sort of developed on the Khan Academy model, which I think is simply marvelous. So I encourage you to go here later and watch some of the other videos if you have questions that arise based upon what I cover in the webinar itself, because it's sort of a condensed version of all of these videos. And this is part one of two parts. The second part of this will be done on Thursday and will cover the other aspects of the model that I'm going to present. So I encourage you to go there sometime later and watch some of the videos, specifically on those points that are of most interest to you. These webinars are in fact free, though donations are greatly appreciated to help cover the overhead associated with doing this. You can donate via PayPal or Google. Systems Thinking World is a 501c3 nonprofit, so for those of you within the U.S., donations are tax deductible. Enough of the advertising. I'll start out. If you have been to the last two webinars, you probably got a piece of this before, but I wanted to make sure that for those of you who are joining for the first time, I'm well grounded in terms of the things that are going to follow this, so that for years I was extremely comfortable with a definition of system developed by Ludwig von Bertalanffy, considered by most to be the father of modern systems theory, and throughout his life he actually used numerous different definitions of what it meant to be a system, but essentially it was something that maintains its existence through the mutual interaction of its parts. It is in fact more about the relationship and the interaction between the parts than it is about the parts themselves. Though over time, and based upon some of the conversations in the Systems Thinking World discussion group, came to realize that there's an aspect that's missing from that particular definition, and it is the fact that a system in fact exhibits characteristics. As a result of those interactions, there is one or more emergent characteristics that are exhibited by that system that you cannot find in any of its parts or any of the subset of parts, so that it maintains its existence through that mutual interaction, and it exhibits characteristics because of those interactions. And typically a system presents a discernible behavior over time. And we'll talk more about that later. The particular set of interactions that one is thinking about, talking about, considering, addressing, around which one establishes a boundary is referred to as the system. And typically systems are open in that they interact with their environment. They're not closed. If you think about yourself as a person being a system, you could not continue to exist without interacting with your environment. We intake food, we intake air, we expel carbon dioxide, waste products, so that there's an interaction with the environment. And at times you get into these esoteric conversations with people that claim that systems don't exist. They're not actually claiming that things don't exist. They're claiming that the concept of system is a mental construct on the part of an individual which embraces a set of interactions, so that when I talk about a person as a system, am I drawing the boundary for that system as the person themselves and everything around it being their environment? Or am I considering several people interacting as a family unit as being the system, and that family exists within an environment? My advice to you is, whenever anyone says the system, your immediate response should be, what does that mean? Because I have repeatedly seen conversations where people have talked past each other on and on and on because they did not have the same perspective of what they were referring to as the system. So that has in fact served me well over time, in that if somebody starts talking about the system, the first thing we got to do is come to an understanding of what is it that you mean by the system. Here are a couple of examples, not all of which I will talk about, but a car is considered to be a system, a set of interacting parts capable of taking one or more people from point A to point B. In the case of the car, there are essential components and non-essential components to it actually accomplishing that end, in terms of I can take the doors off of the car and it will still take me from point A to point B, but it maybe not as safely. If I take the tires off, it doesn't take me anywhere. So that there are components of it which are essential to it accomplishing that end, and then there are those that are not. Water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, which are both gases at room temperature, though when you combine them and you have many, many of them together at once, it produces a characteristic of wetness, which you can't find in any of the components themselves. And a clock is a set of interacting components that, when put together and functioning the way that it's intended to, is able to keep time. Though though you could study a clock, in fact, forever and never develop an understanding of why a minute is as long as it is, you would have to study a clock in the context of its environment, the Earth and its rotation, to understand why a minute is the length that it is. So that while some people talk about systems and they get on this kick about saying synthesis is good and analysis is bad, they are both appropriate. They're like two sides of the same coin, and you can use analysis to take something apart and study it, but to really understand the the way that things emerge, you have to put them back together, and you have to understand the relations, and you have to understand the relation of that within its larger context. So there are lots of examples of systems. The pile of bricks are put here because, I mean, we had an ongoing conversation of about 600 posts trying to come to an agreement as to what might be a system and what might not be. A pile of bricks sitting on the ground is generally not considered to be a system, because if I take one brick away, I still just have a pile of bricks on the ground. Though if I take all those bricks and I pile them up to hold up the corner of the porch, it then has a function, and if I take one brick away, it no longer does that. So depending upon how it's put together, what it's doing determines whether or not it's a system or not. As to whether or not a cookie after it's baked is actually a system, I think the discussion continues, and I'll leave that one there alone. So from that perspective of a system, anytime we set off to do anything, given a situation, my intent is to understand that situation, realizing that reality is complex and complicated, and that cause and effect are often separated by distance and or time. I have to understand enough to develop a strategy that allows me to address the situation with the intent of minimizing the unintended consequences, because experience has taught me that unintended consequences have a tendency to either make the situation worse or create new problems that myself or someone else has to deal with in the future, and sometimes both of them. So the whole idea of a system and systems thinking is that things are related, and there are these conversations that go around where people say that only 10% of the population is actually capable of doing systems thinking. Personally, the only people that I have ever met that are not capable of doing systems thinking are dead people. It's a question of extent or degree. Sometimes some people who play chess understand the moves, and they move one piece at a time, and they simply think about, if I move this, what will my opponent do? And some people think 3 or 4 moves ahead, and some people think all the way to the end of the game, all of the possible alternatives. So think of systems thinking as something that people can in fact do in degrees or to an extent. If when I'm ready to get up in the morning, and before I get out of bed, I think about what it is that I'm going to do as soon as I get up, I've got a situation that I'm considering, that I'm developing a strategy for to deal with that situation, and it all happens in an instant, but it's still, all the pieces are there. And there are certain things that I don't want to do because of what I understand they are likely to create. So we all do systems thinking, but it's a question of the extent or the degree to which people do them. Now, admittedly, there are in fact times when we just react to stuff. I mean, something happens and we're on autopilot and we just react. But if we in fact take at least a moment to think about the event and how we respond to it, we are in fact thinking systemically. Though I said that people can in fact get better at this if they work at it. And the question is, the question I always asked, I mean, I got into this in 1976 when I read Stafford Beer's Platform for Change, and I've sort of been obsessed ever since. I don't think I'm obsessed. My wife tells me I'm obsessed. I just think I'm intent. The question has always been, how do I go about doing this in a repeatable, reliable fashion so that someone else could in fact learn to pursue the same kind of understanding? And if you give the same situation to several people, is there any amount of likelihood that they develop strategies that are valid and viable? Well, this is a picture which I found at the Waters Foundation Systems Thinking in Schools project, which is a marvelous picture. I've had people tell me that they could explain systems thinking to their mother in a grocery store with this picture. It talks about a number of habits, the kinds of things that people should in fact do if they are systems thinkers, and that I should look at the big picture, and I should look at things from different sides, and I should understand how the pieces go together and figure out or think about the implications of my actions before I in fact do them, and all of these other types of things. Though the question continues to be, is there some order to this? I mean, I think about it in the way that I seek the path, I find the path, I travel the path, I become the path. And once I become the path, well, then I don't have to think about how to do it, because I have internalized how to do it to such an extent that I just naturally do it. Though for somebody else that hasn't spent those years internalizing an approach to doing things, what kind of guidance do you give them at the beginning as to how to do this in a sensible fashion? And simply giving someone this picture and say, do this stuff, is not my idea of giving someone a well-ordered set of guidance about how to go about doing something. So I continued to ponder, trying to understand, how does one, if you think that systems thinking is a mindset or a discipline, both are extremely tough to teach or to support. I hate the word teach. To support someone's learning how to go about doing it. And at the same time, systems thinking as presented by numerous giants in the field has continued to evolve over time. And it has continued to evolve because at each stage in its development, they ran into situations that could not be addressed by the methods that currently existed, so that their thinking had to evolve to figure out how to deal with the situations that they previously couldn't deal with. And it's continued to evolve into, hold on just a minute. I'm all gummed up in my throat again today. Into a critical systems thinking approach that in fact encompasses numerous different models, methods, and theories to deal with a situation, though simply giving all that to someone and saying, do this also doesn't help. And there was a point in time when I personally thought that systems thinking was just a not very grown-up version of system dynamics. And I got into this primarily from the system dynamics perspective, so that it was natural to sort of develop that perspective. Though over the years I have come to understand that system thinking is in fact all of this, which creates the problem of trying to understand what to do when and what to expect from it. So Michael C. Jackson from the UK, not the other Michael Jackson, wrote a book called Systems Thinking, Creative Holism for Managers, wherein he created this framework that says, if I think about systems in two dimensions, if I think about those kinds of well-defined systems that have a few interactions, and those interactions are extremely well-defined, and I can consider actually designing and creating those systems, I can think about them as being simple. I can also think about systems which are sort of these amorphous conglomeration of hundreds or thousands of interactions which have sort of evolved on their own over time to which I could not possibly conceive of designing them. The best that I could hope to do is to understand them to some extent. They're essentially what Ackoff called messes. They're complex systems. So if that's one dimension, and the other dimension is the participants involved in that system or set of interactions, I can think about those participants as being three different categories. Unitary in terms of they're well aligned in terms of their beliefs and objectives and what they perceive as being appropriate. So they're well aligned. Pluralist in that they may in fact have differing goals and objectives and beliefs, though they can in fact become aligned in certain instances for particular objectives. And then there are the coercive participants where there's practically nothing that they can agree on. They can't agree what the problem is or what the objectives are, and they will be at odds with each other endlessly. So by creating those two dimensions, he was then able to look at all of the different disciplines and sort of categorize them in terms of hard systems, dynamic systems, soft systems, emancipatory, and postmodern. And in each of those categories, there are multiple models, methods, and theories that have been approached, that have been developed for addressing situations that one wants to deal with. Though there has been a difficulty associated with having people accept systems thinking over the last 60 years, and telling them that it takes 10 years to understand it isn't going to help that situation much at all. So the question is, in fact, how do you take all of the best of all of the different pieces and put something together that allows one to work through this, this set of interactions to arrive at this strategy so that there's a way to deal with the situation in an orderly, well-defined fashion. So what I finally dreamed up was, if I begin with a situation, that situation, all right, I'm going to quickly present you with an overview of a model, and the remaining segments of this session and the session on Thursday will go into those elements in more detail. So if the description of this picture appears to be a bit short, it's okay, all right? In other words, we'll get there. So given the situation is in fact the result of there's some underlying pattern of behavior that has evolved over time that has resulted in this situation. It just didn't appear out of nowhere. And there is in fact some underlying set of interactions that are responsible for creating that pattern of behavior. That pattern of behavior, or that model, is the result of a number of stakeholders who have established a boundary and have created a set of structures and guidelines and rules that are responsible for this model. So that if someone wants to deal with this situation, the stakeholders have to, in fact, understand the model that's responsible for the behavior in that situation. They have to establish a set of boundaries so they understand what it is that what part of, or what set of the interactions they're looking at that they are in a position to deal with, and which ones are part of the environment that they just have to take the way they are and they can't do anything with them. And then they have to look at all of the assumptions that they have made to this point, because if they have defined the situation and the behavior and the model and the boundaries and looked at all of the goals and aspirations of the various stakeholders, in identifying all of that, there have in fact been assumptions made along the way. And what we have continued to find is the worst of our actions are those that are founded on a set of invalid assumptions. We are operating based upon a foundation that is in fact actually wrong. So we have to ferret out and actually validate the assumptions that we have made along the way. Once we do that, we can then go ahead and take the stakeholders, that realization, those assumptions, and they can identify where are the leverage points in that set of interactions that we can identify as the strategy, which when adopted by the stakeholders will improve that set of interaction and at the same time minimize the unintended consequences so that it doesn't make the situation worse or create new problems. So this is the approach that I want to talk about in the next, in the other 35 minutes of today and the rest of it on Thursday. And we'll see how far I get today. And then, so let me get out of this set of models. The first time I did this, I did them all with PowerPoint slides and found out that it just locked me into something that I wasn't comfortable with. So I ended up doing them all in Insight Maker simply because it makes the environment so fluid. I mean, there are times when I have updated the presentation as I was delivering it because I realized that part of it was based on a flawed assumption. So are there any questions to this point? People don't ask questions. I think it's scary. So if I begin with a situation, what I need to in fact distinctly identify is the situation itself, not the system that the situation is part of. I just want what I don't know, maybe it's a dated reference, but there used to be a detective show on TV called Dragnet, and Joe Friday, the detective, he just wanted the facts, just wanted to know what was happening. If you end up trying to define the system, you're putting the cart before the horse. It's just, I need to know what it is. Not I don't want the solution. I don't want to know the cause of the problem. I just want to know what's the situation that I'm trying to deal with. I want my perception of the current situation. And I also need to identify what are the perceived implications of that situation should I in fact do nothing. I mean, if the situation is tolerable as it is and it's not going to get any worse, then I probably don't even need to do anything about it. Though if it is in fact the beginning of something that is going to get much worse, then there is really something that I ought to do about it, and I need to identifying the implications of that situation does in fact provide an impetus for addressing it. Though the question is, what do we want to do about it? An approach that was developed by Russell Ackoff called idealized design is to imagine that everything that exists blew up last night, and you have the opportunity today to completely redesign things in the best possible form that they could be for tomorrow. What would you design? And in doing that, you create something to move toward. I mean, our typical approach to solving problems is to make them go away, to take the current situation and put it back to the way it was before it was intolerable. So we expend a lot of effort going backwards, as opposed to, because the situation is something we in fact want to address, we should in fact figure out how to turn that situation into an opportunity to in fact move forward so that tomorrow is actually better than yesterday. Though we want to do it in a manner where we, as I said, it's a basis for developing a strategy that doesn't make the situation worse or create new problems. If you look at the current problems that we deal with today, the majority of them are in fact direct results of yesterday's solutions. And things just continue to get worse. It's like, was it Pogo said, we have met the enemy and he is us. And, you know, I personally think that we can be better at this. So in conjunction with presenting this method or this approach, there is a fictitious company that I fabricated, and I will use this company to do an example of each segment of this model, so that this company called Network Magic, which is a high-tech company which a couple of years ago brought to market a set of network routers which was at a very nice function price point, so that customer demand has been off the charts since they announced them. And as a result of that, the organization has been scrambling for the last 2 years trying to develop their customer support organization rapidly enough to deal with the growing customer base. And at the same time that customer support is growing, all of the other segments of the organization are growing at the same time, simply trying to find enough resources to deal with the workload that increases. And all of those other organizations have figured out that the best place for them to get resources that know the company and know the customer and know the products is to steal them from customer support, which makes customer support's life even worse. And the organization's concern is that the problem of resources is actually likely to limit the growth potential of the company itself, and what it would really like to do is it would like to reach whatever its growth potential is and not be limited because of what's likely to happen because of the resource constraints. So this is a depiction of what I said that it was appropriate to do over here, not in an enormous amount of detail, but in enough to get a sense, hopefully to get a sense of what it was that I was trying to explain. Hopefully I'm moving forward rather than backwards. So in terms of I said that there's while this is an event, it's a situation, because I'm involved in lots of things, there are many things vying for my attention. And we have a tendency to, okay, Joseph, the title of the webinar today is Systemic Strategy Development. And the video for this will be posted within a couple hours after the session today. So you can catch up from watching the video, Joseph. Because we're distracted, or because all of the things that vie for our attention, they appear as though events, when they get to a point where they get our attention, our immediate response is, how the hell did this happen? Well, if we had been paying attention all along, we would have noticed a pattern of behavior that, if in fact, evolved because of things that changed over time, though because we weren't paying attention, we didn't notice the pattern of behavior. So what's appropriate to do is to, in fact, do research and find that pattern of behavior that has evolved over time to give us a sense of what it is that's interacting, that's responsible for leading up to the situation that got our attention. Though oftentimes the actual data that we need to construct these patterns of behavior simply doesn't exist. Sometimes the best that we can do is to reconstruct them from the stories that people tell in the organization. Though it's appropriate to in fact sketch out the pattern of behavior so we get a sense of what has in fact transpired over time. Now for network magic, because this is in fact a fictitious example, the patterns over time are also fictitious, and I generated them with a simulation. So the patterns of behavior that you sketch out manually are never going to, I'm pretty sure are never going to look this smooth. But the intent is to show that over the last 2 years, the number of new customers that, because of the attractiveness of the products, the number of new customers every month is continuing to grow. And in healthy, successful organizations, customers tend to accumulate, so that the customer base for Network Magic is growing far faster than the new customers. Think of it as though the one salesperson in the organization sells one product to one customer every month. So in the 12th month, they sell one product, but now they actually have 12 customers to support. As a result of that, if you look at the resource growth in the organization, the other organizations have continued to grow over time, though support has grown substantially faster than the rest of the organization, specifically because the customer base that they have to deal with is continuing to grow. So that when sales looks at support, sales says, well, how come you're giving all of the new people to support as opposed to sales? Well, if you gave them all the new people to sales, the company would self-destruct because it couldn't maintain the customer base that it's developing. So on to the next step. The situation as it's perceived is amidst a mess. The short of it is most organizations are in fact a mess. If for anyone willing to admit it, I think. Though I don't have to understand all of the mess. I only need to understand that aspect of it which is relevant to the situation that I'm attempting to deal with. Now, we continue to say from a systems perspective, everything's connected, and I'll admit to that. Though while everything's connected, everything isn't relevant all the time. Was it that quote I saw some places? You can't attempt to solve every problem in the context of the entire universe unless your name is Carl Sagan. So what I have to do is I have to develop a model which is in fact that set of interactions from the overall that are relevant to the situation that I'm trying to figure out how to deal with. And the intent of the model is in fact to promote understanding so that I know what's happening or what has been evolving over time that's actually responsible for the pattern of behavior that I sketched out over time. And the model itself is a simplification of whatever that reality is, so that the comment that was made by George Box, the quote that's often used is, all models are wrong, some models are useful. It's the same kind of quote as the map is not the territory. It's a representation, it's a simplification. Whether it's a good model or not depends upon whether or not it serves its intent, which is to, in fact, promote understanding. And there are lots of different kinds of models that one can develop. Figuring out what kind of model is most appropriate is dependent upon the situation that one is trying to understand. There's a very nice models thinking course given by Scott Page, I think it is, University of Michigan, and it's online, and there are pointers to it in the learning section of Systems Wiki. But it's 10 weeks of 20 videos a week that covers. I was really amazed at the array of models that one might use to understand the situation. So I recommend that set of videos, and I'll put them in the references list. So I have to develop a model that helps me understand the situation. And in the first part of this, I said we take the situation and we don't develop a description of the system, because that would in fact be this model, and that's not going to help us. We in fact have to develop a model that's representative of the interactions that are responsible for the situation I'm trying to deal with. Now I run into lots of people who claim to be systems thinkers, and they probably are. I said, you know, everybody does systems thinking to an extent, but they don't develop any models. Drives me nuts. They write paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and I guess I have to find somebody that I can take notes from, because any time that the situation has more than a couple of interactions, I'm absolutely lost without a picture. I need a model that explains to me, so that I can get all of the interactions there to see what's going on. Otherwise, I'm just lost. Alejandro, go ahead and take a look at the video to get the last section of today before Thursday. Sorry you had to leave. So for network magic itself, the model that I come up with is there's a desired level of support readiness, and there's a current support readiness, and there's a gap between the two of those, and that in fact is an impetus for the organization to hire and train support staff, which results in more trained support staff, which addresses the support readiness, and this is a structure that represents the activities of the support organization. There are thousands of other activities going on in the support organization, but these are the ones that I thought were relevant that I should think about. At the same time that that's happening in the rest of the organization, there's a current level of employees and the employees required, and there's a gap there. And as a result of that, they raid resources from the support, which satisfies this employee requirement, but it in fact reduces the trained support staff. So from what I have thought about to this point, this is a model that I think represents what's happening. Now, this particular model is a causal loop diagram. Its causal loops were an outgrowth of the system dynamics community when they wanted a more simplified picture to explain the findings that they came up with in some of their system dynamics, some of their simulation models. This causal loop diagram notation, there are some variants on this, and I'll talk about that in the modeling and simulation webinar next week if you're interested in detail. There is in fact a large set of people and organizations, primarily within the U.S., that consider this type of thinking to be systems thinking. And as I said earlier, this was in fact my perspective of systems thinking at one point in time. It was a not very grown-up version of system dynamics. currently, the broader perspective of systems thinking is the Jackson model that I showed you. And from my perspective, this is simply a representation of the interaction between a number of elements. It's a generalized approach to thinking about what's happening. I don't consider this to be systems thinking. I don't consider it to be system dynamics. It is an approach to diagramming and understanding a set of interactions. Systems thinking is something much broader than just drawing qualitative pictures. Okay, where am I? Where am I? Oh, uh-oh. Well, okay. I have just found out that I am, in fact, ahead of myself. So I'm going to continue this into part of what I was going to do on Thursday. Some of the slides aren't quite ready, but that's all right. So once I have, in fact, developed the model, a representation of what it is that I think is the set of interactions that I think is responsible for the pattern of behavior that resulted in the situation that I'm trying to deal with, I then have to think about who are the stakeholders that are involved in this situation. Hold on a minute. Joseph asked a question. What means RAID? Oh, sorry. Hold on. Let me go. I got it. The question is, raiding resources means that the other organizations hire the people out of the support organization to come and work in some other portion of the organization. So engineering goes and finds people from the support organization and offers them more money to go to work in engineering, so that engineering finds a person who they don't have to teach about the products or the company or the customers, because they've been supporting the products for weeks or months or years. No, not company's only been in existence for a couple of years. So that engineering now has a resource, and support has a hole. It's sort of like electricity moving, where you have holes and electrons. So the electron went over here, and there's now a hole in support, which means support has to go hire somebody and train them about the company, the customers, and the product, so they can, in fact, support the customer. And in high-tech organizations, it might take 2 to 6 or 8 months to train a person to be well qualified to support the products, depending upon, what array of products they need to be able to support for the customer. And it's training new resources in support is an expensive business, expensive and time-consuming. So hope that helps, Joseph. So once I have developed this model, this set of interactions, there are one or more stakeholders who are, in fact, responsible for that model. They developed the rules, regulations, the structure that is responsible for that set of interactions, and that was done based upon their motivations, their mental models, and it's appropriate to understand who those stakeholders are, and it's also appropriate to have those stakeholders involved in figuring out the strategy, because it is the stakeholders that have to alter the set of interactions to cause tomorrow to be different than yesterday. Hold on a second. I'm having more throat problems. And to my way of thinking, it is in fact the lack of involvement on the part of stakeholders over time that has resulted in the largest amount of wasted, expended effort. I spent a lot of years as a consultant and attempted to develop and help develop answers with people to deal with their situations. Though when I develop an answer for you, then I have to sell it to you. Oh, isn't that what I'm doing now? Ooh, evil, evil. Ask yourself how many people actually go wash their rental cars. It's a question of ownership. So that if I want to develop a strategy that is likely to get implemented, I think it's best if the stakeholders who are responsible for that set of interactions are the ones that actually develop that strategy. Now, you will run into situations where this part of what's really good about Jackson's model is that when you end up over in this realm, the stakeholders typically don't agree on much of anything. They're at odds with each other on an ongoing basis. The thought of the U.S. Congress comes to mind. And when that is the case, one has to pursue slightly different things in terms of diversity and fairness, as opposed to the kinds of concrete solutions that you can pursue if you are in fact dealing with a set of stakeholders which are unitary or pluralist. And you know, we get into that realm. I mean, there's an extent of how deeply I can get into which things in an hour. So just realize that there are in fact different aspects that are pursuable, or different types of objectives which are pursuable based upon the nature of those involved. Though if they're not involved, then it's highly unlikely that the result actually does anything except sit on the shelf someplace. Sometimes too. Rake makes a comment that sometimes stakeholders are so involved in the system that they won't and almost can't work on it. For example, a couple going through a domestic dispute. Well, they can't work on it alone, though. Is there any likelihood that someone else deciding on the answer to the dispute without them is really going to settle the situation as opposed to just accommodate it? I suppose we could talk about that for a while, Ray. So where am I? Jackson's Trainer. So when I think about the situation with Network Magic and I think about the stakeholders, I think that there is customer support. There are the other organizations within Network Magic. There are the customers, and then there is the management of the organization. Other orgs represents lots of different segments of the organization, but again, back to my initial premise in that I really only have to describe the set of interactions and the participants to the extent that's relevant to the situation. I can lump a dozen other segments of Network Magic into one entity because they're all doing the same thing at the moment. And the nature of the interactions has to do with all of them and their interactions with support, so that I don't need to explicitly identify 10 or 12 different organizations over here. Okay. And then back to what I said before about, there is a system and it interacts with its environment, and I need a boundary to understand which aspect of, where are the things that I consider part of what I can deal with and what are part of the environment and are simply not addressable. So that there can in fact be numerous entities inside the boundary that are part of what we can work with, and then there are those things outside the boundary that we don't think that we can do anything about. And as you continue to evolve the understanding, sometimes things move inside, end up moving outside, and sometimes outside end up moving inside. The boundary is in fact in a state of flux based upon the level of understanding that you develop, so that you can, you get to a certain level of understanding and you say, well, unless we in fact have this piece, we figure out how to include this piece and the stakeholder that's responsible for this piece as part of the group that's working on the solution, we'll never be able to develop anything that actually addresses the situation. So this sequence that I'm describing is not a one-pass model. It's an iterative model. It's a evolving process, like the interaction between me and my models. I sit down and I build a model because this is what I think, and I give it all of the things that I think I understand, and when I'm building simulations, I then go ahead and run the model, and the model says, well, either your assumptions are wrong or you built the model wrong, because reality is simply not this ridiculous. So go think about it some more. So the whole model that I'm describing is one that I as an individual might pick a situation and I might work through the whole model by myself, or I might work with it or work through it with a couple of people, because we're essentially doing our homework to work through that model with all of the appropriate stakeholders. And someone said to me, how is it that you can define this linear process for developing a systemic strategy? And my comment is, there are actually dozens of feedback paths that are part of that model that I left off of the diagram because I didn't want it to look like the mess that the other diagrams and make it difficult to follow. So there are almost all of the stages feedback to the prior stages to say, is there something I learned at this point that makes it appropriate to go back and rethink one of the previous steps? That's why I continue to say that it's iterative. So from here is an example that I often use to give a sense of boundaries having multiple purposes. This is a model that has to do with the implications of early hospital discharges, and it has three different sets of stakeholders. It has the community from which individuals enter the hospital system, and once an individual is discharged from the hospital, they end up in post-hospital services, sometimes, not always. If you ask the people in the community about the system, this is what they think is the system, and all of this is part of their environment. If you ask the people in the hospital about the system, this is the system, and everything else is the environment. And the same thing with the post-hospital services. This is their world. This is the system from their perspective, and everything else is the environment. So in this particular model, boundaries are used to identify which sets of interactions are primarily the responsibility of which stakeholders, and all of them together are considered to be the addressable system, and there is nothing here that's considered to be part of the environment, though there are in fact some things, they're just not drawn. Panos asked the question about how can we bind an endogenous variable with an exogenous variable from a different model. I'm not in a simulation. Let me think about that one, Panos. Maybe I'll send you a direct message so I can clarify it. The questions that get asked, I answer them as best I can in the session, though the answers are actually, the question and answers are actually put together and posted online so that you can review them once the video is posted. So from the perspective of Network Magic itself as an organization, this is the way I took the model that I had previously developed, and I said that here's the other organizations grouping. I used what I developed when I identified the stakeholders. Here's what's happening in the customer's environment, the support environment, and Network Magic as a company encompasses both of these two components. So I now have I've extended the model that I previously developed because there are some interactions that are happening that I didn't need to think about until I got to a point of looking at the customer as one of the components of the set of interactions responsible for the situation. So now I'm running overtime. So back to, in closing, on Thursday, I will finish going through this model, and I guess on Thursday I won't be covering quite as many pieces as I thought I was covering because I already covered some of them. So, and on the webinars page itself, within a couple hours, right down here in the previous webinars segment, the video link will be posted for this particular webinar. And if you go to the Systems Wiki YouTube page and subscribe, you'll get a notification every time we do new videos, so that we do, in addition to doing the videos for the webinars, there is an ongoing development of videos to explain various concepts that people ask questions about here and there. So as I said, the webinars are free. Donations to cover overhead are greatly appreciated. So far, this has been the expenses as of the end of last month, and this has been the donations so far year to date. And right here is the link to the Q&A page. So from previous sessions, here are some questions and answers, and the ones from today will be posted in the same way. I mean, the stuff that's noise I don't post, but if it's a looks like a question that others are likely to benefit from the answer to, I'll go ahead and post the Q&A. So, are there any questions? Sorry about misdoing the timing. I mean, every time I do one of these sessions, it seems like the content shifts a little bit, and it's hard to work out the timing for it specifically. So, oh, Ahmad, you made it finally for a change. Glad to see you. Well, come back on Thursday. I find that the Tuesday session seems to scare a lot of people off, and they don't come back for Thursday. I have to figure out what I'm doing to people. So hopefully I'll see you on Thursday. Take care. Bye.